The struggles and successes of a 199-year-old startup. That's coming up. And welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. If you're a pastor or the member of a mainline Protestant denomination, you're probably incredibly used to hearing about how we're shrinking. Our churches are getting smaller and smaller. Many are ending their visible ministries after decades of service. There always seems to be a blog post somewhere that says that Lutherans or Episcopalians or Presbyterians will be down to zero by 2040 or 2050. It's just a whole lot of bad news. But every so often, you hear a story of a mainline Protestant church that seems to buck the trend. It's a church that seems to be attracting people instead of losing people, a church that seems to be bursting with kids, and a church that seems to be looking forward towards the future instead of backwards towards the past. Well, that's the story for St. John's Park Slope. It is the second oldest Episcopal church in Brooklyn, but in the words of its pastor, it acts as a 199-year-old startup. An article in the church magazine, The Living Church, from 2024 talks about all the changes that are taking place in the congregation. And they interviewed a number of people connected to the congregation, including today's guest, Ben DeHart, who is the rector or pastor of the congregation. So in this episode, we're going to talk about what's going on at St. John's Park Slope. Ben will talk about everything that's happening, all the good things, all the struggles. And I'm hoping that it will offer a bit of inspiration, not necessarily here are the steps you should do, but hopefully some inspiration for those of us who are leading similar congregations. So, without further ado, please join me in this conversation with Ben DeHart. All right, Ben, thank you for joining me here. I wanted to start off by just asking you a few questions about your background, your faith journey. Where did you grow up? How did you enter into the church, and kind of go from there?
Yeah, so I grew up in New Jersey, loved it there, have a Jewish mother, Roman Catholic father. My dad is he's not even a C&E Catholic, if you know what that means. Christmas and Easter, he's a Christmas Catholic. I don't think he has any problem with the resurrection, but for some reason we would only go to midnight mass every Christmas. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't have a deep faith of his own, but I'll let that stand. My mother, grew up Jewish family. She kind of did have an experience with the Jesus movement in the late 60s, early 70s. But, as many of your listeners probably know, it's when you're Jewish, even if it's very much just secular and cultural, it's very hard to take anything else on, nor would I want her to shed that. So my mom also kind of was a person of faith, a spiritual person, but it was really friends. I lived in a townhome community. They had this, evangelical church, a great vacation Bible school. I went, fell in love with it. And like a good VBS, right? You're having lots of fun as a kid. And then there's somebody who talks about Jesus. And I was sold. I was all in, and went to this kind of evangelical church. I think it is officially a denomination, Christian Missionary Alliance.
Oh, yeah.
And they formed devotion to Christ in me. And I'm, forever indebted to them. I mean, I know we say a lot about uppercase evangelicals these days, but sometimes I feel like we focus on that so much to avoid our own problems and live into our denials. But yeah, I mean, like I would not be where I am now without them. And it really wasn't until college. I was a history major, ancient history guy, and kind of wondered about like, well, what about like the 1700 years beforehand? And there was this incredible Episcopal church plant with a great preacher, great pastor. I thought every Episcopal church really cared about preaching. And it was there that I really, the preacher there, the priest there said, I think you should think about the ministry and that you would be, I think he was nervous. He said, be a killer priest. And I told him no. And 8 months later, I said he bewitched me. And, here we are 15 years later.
Wow. And so you are now at St. John's in Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about how you got to St. John's. And
yeah. So I was in Manhattan for 10 years at a church in Gramercy, which I still love, and helped out a friend of mine in Birmingham, Alabama, for a little over a year, and that was wonderful as well. Very much a different culture, but hey, 3-4 months in, I was kind of like wondering, am I staying in Alabama forever? But this opportunity came up in Brooklyn. Again, I'm from New Jersey, closer to home. And I had heard about this church before, but when I first heard about it, I was like, that's way too hard a job. I'm not doing that. It's one of these restarts, of which we have many in the mainline world. This time, I think I was a little bit more ready. And the kind of interim priest was someone I knew, and I knew they were doing really good work. So I came in, and my first, Sundays, there were like 35 people there. I definitely was like, oh my gosh, what have I done? But yeah, I mean, and I love this area. I love Brooklyn. So here we are, a little over 2 years later, and it's been stressful, but a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. And how would you describe the Park Slope area of Brooklyn?
Yeah, so Park Slope is a brownstone neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Now, with the big migration waves from the islands, this was a Caribbean church until probably the 80s, even early 90s. And we still have probably 35% of our parishioners are either from the Caribbean or African American. And I love that. It's like there's a natural built-in diversity that's not like, you know what I mean? Sometimes we, in like kind of white mainline churches, we talk about it so much, but we don't have it at all. Or it's like a little bit forced. The folks here, they've been here since like the 60s and 70s and 80s. And, but Park Slope has very much gentrified, and it's very wealthy now. I mean, my wife and my wife's very involved in the church. We do not live in Park Slope, although I am here maybe more than I am in across Prospect Park, if you're at all familiar with New York. But yeah, no, it's one of these things where it's like Brooklyn would be the 4th largest city in the U.S. if it weren't connected to New York City. So we're in a situation where there are so many people. The primary method of transportation is train or bus or walking everywhere. And that's really helped us out a lot.
So I'm kind of curious, one of the things that you I read the article in the Living Church about you and the church and everything. And one of the things that you say is that at the time when it was written that it was a 198-year-old startup, but now it's a 199-year-old startup. But what do you mean by that? What, can you kind of flesh that out a bit?
Well, I think I'm stealing that a little bit from the previous church I was at. They didn't say the years, but like, hey, we're over 100 years old. We're not one of these kind of evangelical church plants, which, good on them. We've got these buildings that are crumbling, that have a lot of history. We're on the shoulders of giants. We have all of the good things they did and all of the maybe not so great things. But what I really mean by that is we are a restart. Within my first 6 months at St. John's, we ran out of money. And I had to do this like kind of special appeal. So it really was one of these, not every mainline or just any kind of preacher can do, but it really was, all right, what is essential to keep because we do need to open ourselves to people on the outside. We can't necessarily cling to the way we've always done things, or in our tradition, like the prayers of the people, where that part where like you add your own intercessions. We're not going to pause and point to everyone to be like, what do you want to add? It's just very kind of, I don't know, off-putting to people there for the first time. It's a beautiful thing, don't get me wrong. But even more, and just trying to be outward looking, trying to, I don't know, again, hold the best of what our tradition has to offer, but also kind of engaging the new Brooklyn around us, who up until 2 years ago stayed away in droves.
What do you think is bringing them in?
I think there are many factors. I think I mentioned my wife. She is a kid whisperer, and she is now the canon for youth and young adults for the entire Diocese of Long Island, which includes Brooklyn and Queens. So she is incredible. I'll see these new kids come in. They go to Sunday school for the first time. Our kids, they come back up in time for communion. And this kid I've never seen before is leaning with his head against Chelsea. So having a solid youth ministry has been huge. My music director is a wonder. I mean, part of the reason why I came here was I had worked with this guy before, and he just kind of blends the best of our 1982 hymnal with spirituals, with contemporary stuff that I have no idea where it's coming from, but people love it. And then for me personally, I'm just trying to preach the absolute best sermon I can every week. And for you preachers listening, I'm solo. I get it. It's tough to do it week in and week out, but I really make it a priority for my week. I just to give a little context, I don't really have a staff. Like, I'm the parish administrator. I'm plugging things into, QuickBooks, dealing with, some remote finance person. So it's like it's like, I'm overwhelmed. We ran out of money. We rent our rectory, so I'm kind of a property manager. I'm not really saying this to brag by any means. In fact, sometimes I'm just like, please give me all the help in the world. But it really is like, I want first things to be first. And I do think like having a solid service that is graceful, but not folksy, right? I'm not like an Anglo-Catholic here. I mean, my church is a little bit higher church. The Caribbean Anglicans in the Episcopal Church in Long Island tend to be more Anglo-Catholic. That's one of the things where it's like, hey, I wear a chasuble, and hey, I love the way it looks, and hey, I do believe that God meets us in his Son in the sacrament. So we've kind of moved toward each other. And I think it's just the advantage I have over people in the burbs is that we probably get 4 or 5 newcomers every Sunday, just by virtue of being in this massive city with people on top of each other. And so for me, it's been a little bit less like going out, getting our name out there. Although I do, take our website and our social media pretty seriously. It's been more of, how do I get the people who walk through these doors stuck here? And those 3 things are a big part of it, but also having places to plug people in. So we've started this, we call it the adultish group, because it's like 20s and 30s, but also for like me in my early 40s. Like we want to have places to put people. We have this kind of theology on tap, which we call public theology, which any age can go to. We have a retiree group, which has turned into more than a retiree group that meets after our Wednesday services, because like, single parents might go to that. We also do a lot of these kind of like off the wall stuff. Like we started this hiking club because some parishioner was like, hey, I love to hike, and I bet people would too. And I'm kind of when it comes to lay people offering suggestions, I tend to be a yes man, meaning like, we'll try it once. We'll see how it works. I didn't realize like when we were pretty small at that time, like our entire congregation came out to hike up the Hudson because everyone's dying to get out of the city for a day. And we'll have barbecues, and we're pretty lucky to have a garden in front of our church in Brooklyn where almost no one has outdoor space. So like we're having these barbecues and people are walking by and they're hearing music and seeing people hang, and it's like, oh, like that's kind of cool. So a bunch of this stuff. We go on a lot of outings together. But honestly, man, like the wildest thing is I do all this stuff and have this big social media presence. And 9 times out of 10, when I ask people, how'd you find our church? They're like, oh, Google Maps. Google. It's like, okay. So you never know. Doesn't mean all that stuff is null and void, but, and I think it's a big part of getting the people who walk through our doors stuck there. But the Holy Spirit's going to do what the Holy Spirit does.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So you kind of hinted on this earlier. We talked about this before we started the recording. How important is preaching, especially in the light of a restart? Mm-hmm. Sometimes preaching can mean so many different things to so many different people. And I think, at least personally to me, the essence of good preaching really matters to a church, no matter what its size, just because it means something to people. And I think pairing that with social media can also have an advantage and reach to people. I think that's been a way that people have heard about the congregation that I pastor. Awesome. So how important is really solid preaching been to you in kind of the development of this community?
Well, I think you're near Lutheran seminary, and I think the mm-hmm. Lutherans still tend to value preaching more. But I'm talking to any Episcopalian listening, or any mainliner, or maybe even Roman Catholic who might be listening, who might be tempted to be like, well, we've got the Mass, or we've got the Eucharist. Is the homily all that important? Or maybe it's just because you've heard so much bad preaching. You're just like, is it even really all that necessary? If there's one thing I want to say, it is that it is most necessary. I hope this doesn't sound like I'm into myself. I don't think I'm the best preacher of all time. I think that Fleming Rutledge, the Beyonce of Anglicanism, is the mm-hmm. best preacher of all time. And her fingerprints are all over my brain. But I when I first got there, this church was not used to really. The homilies were pretty much an afterthought. And that's no slam on the people who came before me, whatever. That's how they were trained. And it was like a pretty cold congregation. Now, the people were lovely, but it's like during the sermon, there was no kind of interaction. You know what I mean? And so at first I kind of was like overcompensating because I was used to kind of like these like, maybe a little bit less than in the Black church where you get kind of that like verbal reinforcement, but getting that kind of like, people moving towards you. There's an energy in the room. And between my first Sunday at St. John's and now, that has completely changed. And I think it really all has to do with the fact that I have essentially told them, I'm going to put my heart and soul into this. You can agree with it. You can disagree with it. Talk to me after. Ideally not that Sunday because I'm fragile. Talk to me on Monday if you disagree with it. But I think that, we are a congregation. It's Brooklyn. It's on one level what you think it is, but also people are much more complicated than, this is a blue city or, whatever. Mm-hmm. But I can tell like people are leaning towards me. Now, here's where I'll get like a little didactic, and I'd love to hear what you have to say, Dennis. But for me, like, a good sermon is not necessarily a lecture. It's, taking the text very seriously. I'm like a big, like, gospel guy. I want to preach people the balm of Gilead, the good news. And I want to preach it in a way where it intersects with their wounds, with what they're bringing. And a lot of times I'm just preaching to myself, not because, I'm trying to preach to more than just myself, but if I'm being authentic up there, again, not doing like a TMI kind of situation, but acknowledging where I fall short, where the gospel hits my wounds that I feel comfortable talking about. I just, people who I would at first see kind of sleeping in the church or their eyes glaze over when I first start, all of a sudden those people are the people leaning in. I don't know. I'd love to hear from you. I told you I'm influenced by Fleming, and she's very influenced by the Black church for sure. Mm-hmm. And just turns of phrases like the Lord who makes a way out of no way that I think Andrew Young coined. It's just like, man, like this makes even mainliners start to question their belief that Jesus isn't actually alive.
Hmm.
And I think that's like been part of our DNA, that we serve the God who makes a way out of no way, and that this isn't really about us, but it's about coming into church to see what God is up to.
Well, I think, as I said, I grew up in the Black church, but I think you said something earlier about being near a Lutheran seminary, and I went to Luther Seminary to get my MDiv. And one of the things I remember during one of the chapel services, one of the professors of rhetoric, Gracia Grindle, was preaching. And she said something at one point that she said, people out there, even if they're, you're preaching at an old folks home, it's kind of like, give us the gospel. We don't want to hear stories about bunny rabbits or, whatever. They want the gospel. And that is stuck in my brain now. Maybe that was 25 years ago. And I think that that's important in the preaching that people want to hear the good news. They want to hear the gospel. And, it's not a lecture. It's not a pep talk. It's not a TED talk. It is about preaching the good news of Jesus, and kind of making that the point, is so important. And, I've been part of the Iowa Preachers Project. This is kind of their initial year. And that has been kind of brought home. We've had guest people in, and as we kind of are going through our workshops and preaching and all that, is the importance of how many people need to hear the gospel. And I think you've kind of brought this up, and one of the speakers actually we were in California in January, was Dave Zoll. And he talks a lot about something that you're talking about, is, in some ways, we're also preaching to ourselves. Because we are not all that. We have our own things where we fall short. And so that we need to hear the good news. And it doesn't mean that you are preaching, as you said, kind of TMI. But it is that this is as much about you hearing that good news, as much as it is other people, because when that happens, it somehow connects with others who are feeling that same thing. And I think
especially
that
if you're
allows
preaching
them to
every
connect.
week, right? Like
Yeah,
if you
exactly.
got to get up there every single week, I don't know how you're not going to get burned out or lose some fire if you're not in your prep, in the act, like preaching the gospel to yourself. I don't know. Before this church, I was at churches with staff and would preach, once a month or twice a month or something like that. And I think you can kind of get away with, I don't know. I mean, I love my colleagues, and my colleagues are in many ways very open with me about how, like, man, like I had so much verve coming into this, and where am I now? And I mean, hey, there by the grace of God, go I there in 5 years, 10 years. But I think what's been kind of a Holy Spirit antidote has really been like, all right, like, where is this kind of hitting me where I live? And of course, like extending that to people who look differently than you, than might be a different Enneagram than you or whatever. But I mean, otherwise, yeah, I just, maybe then you do start to be like, it's just about the Eucharist.
Yeah. And I think people, it's not to say that things like communion or the rest of the service don't matter. They do. They're important.
Definitely.
But I feel like, and this is kind of where you talk about Fleming Rutledge, who I also adore, is that she is able to understand the importance of this. These are not just simply mere words. There's something powerful about the scripture and what it's saying, and that people in many ways are hungry for it. They won't say it, but they are.
Yeah, 100%. And maybe this is like, I mean, I'm guessing your listeners from all over the theological and denominational map. When I went into that Episcopal church plant however many years ago it was, coming from like being formed by evangelicals, of course I was glad that the priest there was a great preacher. But at that time, I really did need this kind of rootedness, the liturgy, and probably most importantly, the sacrament. And the reason why I'm harping so hard on preaching is that in my tradition, in the Episcopal Church, there's so much emphasis on the sacrament, rightly so. But the corrective, I think, here is why not what Thomas Cranmer said, word and sacrament? Why not both? It's kind of, let's do both really well if we've got them, rather than like, oh, this is more important than that. Like, come on.
So I'm kind of curious, why do you think in some churches it's not considered, like the preaching is not considered as important?
I really think a lot of it has to do with what we see on TV, or maybe you hear on a podcast or something from someone who's really out there, someone who's essentially promising you wealth if you give them money or something like that. Maybe some of it is really folks had homilists who weren't all that great. So it was like, oh, can this be over already? And I still am. Like, I'm totally cool with the whole like 10 to 12 minute homilies. It tends to be what I do. I mean, maybe there was a time when we had attention spans for more than that. I mean, Fleming Rutledge can go for 25 minutes. I'll listen to her all day. Probably David Zoll as well. But I really think it has to do with seeing preaching done poorly, seeing people take advantage of people with it. I don't know. I think also, I wonder what you think about this. I do think there is in our mainline churches, and I'm not trying to be too hard on this because I think I've had periods in my life where I was there, but I'm not so sure what I make about any of this. I want to believe. I aspire to believe. But I almost kind of prefer the whole, like, let's keep it in this place of we don't know. And the sacrament can be great, but the preaching, sometimes that gets in the way of that. Now, when I say I was there, I was probably there for like 30 days or something like that. But yeah, no, I think there are parishioners in my church who have really come around, who maybe even at first were like, all right, you kind of sound like one of these, preachers who's a little too fired up. But now I think after a little while, it's kind of like, oh yeah, this is just as important. I don't know. I'm curious. In your tradition, is it like a preaching first, the tradition you're in now?
My tradition is an interesting one because it is one of the things about the disciples is that they believe in communion every Sunday. Actually, the logo for our denomination is a chalice with St. Andrew's cross. So it's that has always been important to us, but so is preaching. So it's kind of this weird hybrid in some ways of how it comes together. And I think that most disciple churches are still pretty good at doing the communion every Sunday. They're not, I think if you said you're not having communion, there would be a riot because that's so important to us. The preaching has kind of, I think it's gone through phases where it was really good and phases where it's feels like it's more of a lecture sometimes. So it kind of goes through good times and through bad times. And there are good preachers and okay preachers. So it kind of that's kind of where that is. I think there has been in the past an emphasis on preaching. The question is now, is it how good is it, and how do we are able to kind of bring the gospel and not have it just kind of be sometimes, because I think sometimes the danger is to make it kind of more of like a political speech or something. And you don't want that either, even though there may be issues of issues like social justice that are important. You still want to get the gospel in there in some way. So I think that has been kind of a struggle for us, I would say, within the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, no, and I would say echo that. I know, first, I want to do say that there is a great history of wonderful Episcopal Anglican preaching,
Hmm.
but that's not your first thought if
No,
you're
it's
in a
not.
different denomination or even ours. And I think we can reclaim that. And that doesn't mean, I think, like, I don't want to intimidate people. Like, maybe I led with, right, I'm not the best preacher. We
Hmm.
already know who is, at least in my tradition. Um, but I think there are things like, and hey, sign up for what Dennis is doing, the Iowa preaching project, or just for me, I think what really helped me was I'm probably a cross between, like, probably found a little bit of my own voice 5 years ago, but for a long time it really was like I was trying to almost imitate Fleming Rutledge, was trying to imitate the priest who I came into the Episcopal Church loving. And then I think for a little while there was like a cross imitation between, I guess, what they were both good at. So I don't think it needs to be like, well, I already know I'm not the best preacher of all time. I'm just going to ignore this. I do think like there are a handful of great preachers out there,
Hmm.
but our people, the bar is so low. And if you can, talk about the text, if you can really hit the gospel, if you can hit people where they're at. I mean, I'm a fan of the illustrations. I'm not as good at the illustrations as Dave Zoll or some of these people. So I steal from those guys. And kind of what you said, I liked it. If your illustration feels like, well, I just need one, but it's like a flower kind of thing that you're like, well, like, I don't know, it's not really compelling. Well, then just don't do it. But I probably have too many thoughts on preaching, but only because I think it really is so valuable, even one that is not gonna be published somewhere.
Hmm. You know, kind of leading into that is I've noticed your use of social media, um, and how you use, sermons that you've preached or are going to preach, um, and kind of sharing that on Facebook. And I know that you also have a pretty good following on Instagram. And I'm kind of curious how has that helped the congregation? What are some of the strategies you're kind of thinking about when you do things? And the reason I ask all that is because I was kind of maybe 20 years ago when Facebook was coming out, one of those people that were kind of promoting it. And um, obviously, social media has its downsides. And I think maybe in the last 10 years or so, that seems to be the only thing that we can talk about now is that it's all bad. But I think you're still someone that can use it to some good. And I'm kind of curious, how have you done that? And not to say here are the 10 secrets that you can do, but what has worked for you?
Yeah, no, great question. I think I was kind of pretty down on it until about a year or two before the pandemic, mostly because, sometimes it's just popular to hate.
Hmm.
And yes, of course, it's gotten out of control. I think it's really can be poisonous for some people. I mean, like,
Hmm.
whether you're on the right or left or whatever you want to call yourself, like the propensity to dunk on other people and Christians, like, and that's not to say we can't call people out for, what they're doing that's wrong or this or that. But the dunking is just, I read it and it's like that, that tablet that tastes good, but it's actually poisonous for you. And so I do think that we could, take a step back. But what I'm really trying to do with it is get the word out there about St. John's Park Slope.
Mm.
I've got this 199-year-old building that we ran out of money when I first got there. I was able to renovate and rent the rectory that I'll never live in, but it's okay because Park Slope, listen to these numbers. One apartment goes for $10,000 a month and the other goes for $12,000 a month. So this has really helped our church. Now, granted, everything costs more in New York City. So it's not like we're in the clear because of that. But I am just trying to, if there's a vision behind my social media, it is, what are we about? We are this 199-year-old startup that exists to preach the gospel. Now, of course, the gospel alone has question marks, but the way I kind of live into that is I kind of, in my social media posting, am really big on our message. And our message really is, and I'm stealing this probably from Dave Zoll, the one-way love of God for suffering sinners like you and me. And what that means is so much in our churches, the emphasis is on what we can do for God. How are we getting right with God? And of course, I think that's important, but I think it just like gets it reversed. It's, how do people change? How did I change? I felt this love that would not let me go. That was the best thing in the world. And so what I'm trying to do through my social media, which is largely message focused, is that very thing, that despite everything, God in Christ is moving towards us. Now that looks differently, and of course we have an old building, so I take pictures of it and post it because it's just incredible. If you knew about the roof, well, you might be crying along with me. And for our 200th, for our bicentennial, we're gonna do a capital campaign for the roof. So shameless plug. But really, it's I think while there are many problems with social media or its potential for addiction, etc. I mean, if you totally eschew it, like you're kind of missing out on a way to make people know that you're there. And maybe it is. Maybe people do find your church on Google, but after the fact, they'll look at your website and see if there's any life. And social media does make it seem like there's life. If like there's an event and you take a picture of the people of the event, and again, that can easily become this kind of like showy kind of thing. And I would love to say that I've always been a person of integrity with that stuff. I hope so, but I probably exaggerated it because I'm such a control freak. But really, yeah, like I'm trying to get out there what matters most here. We really want to form children in the faith. We really want to worship and praise in a way that honors God, but it's also just buoyant and really well done. I want, and I'm not the only one doing our Christian ed too. It's I want it to be something that is more than like in my tradition. Sometimes when we have saints' days, and some people do this really well, so I don't want to knock on it, but sometimes it's like you read from the lesser feast and fast bio of that saint, and that's the homily. And I don't know about you, but for me, I'm just like, I totally get why people are like, forget the homily altogether. It's like, I can get that easily on Wikipedia or whatever.
I was going to say that it's like, did you just read a Wikipedia entry?
Yeah. And again, I'm not trying to be too hard on clergy. I mean, for those of you who aren't clergy, I know we all love to joke that we have one day a week where we work. But for those of us who are, trying to keep 199-year-old churches alive, or your church, right? It's, oh my gosh, these buildings, the fundraising, the sheep whom I love, who think I only work on a Sunday. It's a lot. It's a lot of kind of emotional labor. But what we're really trying to do here is at the end of the day, preach the gospel, preach it well, have lives be seized by the good news. And that's why, like, I'm dealing with a congregation that doesn't have much biblical or theological literacy at all. So I put out kind of like a devotional reflection of the skeleton of my sermon out on a Thursday. And then my sermon, which is in that same ballpark, but I don't use a manuscript. I like have like kind of bullets. I kind of want to be more present, but it really is, for us, it's really been, the primary thing is the message. And then it's also about like getting plugged in. And those are the two things I really focus on our social media. Do I do it well? I mean, because I've got all this other stuff going on, it's like always a little bit last minute. I feel like because I've been doing it for a long time, I can kind of do it okay. But you as a communications guy, you probably could crush what I'm doing or tell me everything of how I could improve.
I think you're actually doing it pretty well. I mean,
I love
I've
it.
seen your skeleton of sermons, and I think those are really helpful, and can be helpful for people to kind of see where you're going, or even if they are looking for a church, that's a way of understanding.
Hmm.
Oh, okay, and maybe I want to hear more. So yeah, I think that those things are really, really good. That you're not just using social media as a bulletin board,
Hmm.
but actually something that's more interactive, which is really the whole point of it. So yeah,
Well, I'll receive that.
okay. I think one question that I would have is, obviously there are a lot of people in that similar situations where they're in churches that are restarting or redeveloping or other things to that extent. Um, what advice or what words of hope, maybe is probably even a better thing
Mhm.
to say, would you give to pastors or even to people in judicatories as they're looking at congregations that they really think there's something there if just something could happen? Um, what words of hope that you would give them?
Well, I'll start with just if you're thinking about restarting a church, pastor, or you are in a church restart, I am just so happy that you're thinking about it, that you're doing it. It's tough work.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to say this too much because my church has been like very thankful, but it can be pretty thankless work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's not the, you know, sexy advertised cardinal parishes. I don't know if that's the same lingo in your world. But we have so many of these churches. And I know so I don't know about your tradition, but in our tradition, I think we've gotten a little bit better about this, but we, when we've shut down churches, we've called them celebrations, which seems a lot like death denial to me. I'm not like, again, I'm not trying to say you don't have like a service that's like gives gratitude for, you know, the 150 years that the gospel has gone forth from this place, but I'm pretty sure in your tradition there are churches that are on the cusp or on the brink. And for you called it judicatory, like in our diocesan
Mm-hmm.
level, people like, I mean, yeah, you got to make some hard decisions and maybe make some like, well, what's more likely a place that could come back? I don't think the whole like let's combine three churches into one who are, you know, 25 miles away, that's magically gonna work. I think, again, I speak from someone who has no power whatsoever. I think the people in power, I would love to see people make decisions that not everyone's going to be happy with, but are guided by, I don't know, expertise
Mm-hmm.
and prayer. But really, I mean, I'm talking to people mainly from a city setting because that's where I'm at. But if you think that the narrative of decline means that people don't want to go to church, that is just not true. And it seems like the new Pew Research studies are that actually the people who we thought were the least religious are actually looking to get into institutional religion, a little bit less into the spiritual but not religious that we kind of exennials or millennials were into. So I don't know. It's just, I don't think there's a blueprint. I think the message of hope is like, preach the gospel. I don't even really want to give a blueprint. I've kind of talked about what I've done. You've heard, read Andy Root. Go listen to Dennis's past episodes with Andy Root for some more expertise. But I just want to thank you for thinking about it, for doing it. And I do think that some of us worry, like, well, what if it fails? But I don't know. Like, at least in my tradition, I think there's more and more. Well, this person took that risk. And who are we to think that it's going to work the very first time that someone like takes this risk? Like it might have to be your second try
Yep.
at a restart. God willing, it would be the first, but I don't know. I just think that if you're going into that world, keep the main thing, to quote the MVP winning Super Bowl MVP of the Philadelphia Eagles, Jalen Hurts. Yes, like we do need to call out bad things, and the gospel is more than just this kind of personal religion. It includes everything. But mainliners, I think that at times we err so hard on the corporate or the apocalyptic stuff that I think is very valuable, but we're kind of missing that. I mean, our people are getting better op-eds from the New York Times podcasts, from the stuff that they're flooded with 7 days a week. And I do think that people primarily are looking for a word of hope, a real hope, of that way that makes a way out of no way. Yes, in society, but probably because we're, selfish beings, and I'm including myself in this, I need it to be for me first. I think a lot of us are kind of like barely hanging on. And like the flight attendant tells us, you got to put that oxygen mask on yourself first before you can help anyone else. Also, finally, this is a hobby horse of mine, so forgive me. But like, good preaching is not what I do with the people closest to me. It's not lectures. It's not criticism. It's not unsolicited advice. When I get that, what do? I run in the exact opposite direction. What has seized me in the past is the balm of Gilead that's too good to be true and yet is. And I really do think that is what births goodness, and not the guilt trips, not the... And I'm not just talking about, like, your fundamentalist church that maybe you grew up in. I'm talking about us. We do it in a different way. So forgive me, folks, but that's my hobby horse.
No, I totally get that. And, I think people are looking for something that will kind of help them, or they need a word of hope that's important. And I think sometimes, especially in mainline churches, we forget that, or we're so afraid of talking about a personalized religion that we kind of skip over that, but don't realize that, as you said earlier, it's both. It's kind of like that commercial with the little girl that says, "Why not both?" It is both. And so, people need that sense of knowing that they're loved by God. And we also need to talk about some of the ills in our society, but it's both. And so I kind of always wanted to hope and see a kind of a balanced gospel. Because I think sometimes we lean towards one or the other, and sometimes it's not leaning. Sometimes it's just, we're just way over here and not seeing the other side. And I think the other thing that is important that I've learned and that you kind of picked up on is, and why I kind of changed the word from advice to hope, is that so much of our, especially in church circles, is this sense of, here are these steps that you can do. And that doesn't always work for a lot of different reasons. Maybe because things are so personalized or so in a certain situation, that what works in one church may not work in another church. What works in a church in a large urban area may not work in a suburb or in a rural area. But I think what is important is to hear the sense that God is with us, the sense of preaching the gospel. Those things are always important, and to have that sense of hope and maybe encouragement, I think is more important than, here are the 5 steps you can do to increase church attendance.
Totally. Yeah, I think to go back to what you were talking about earlier, I think we mainliners are afraid of proclamation. Maybe like the one kind of proclamation we're not afraid of is prophecy or the prophetic. But what about the kerygma? What about, I don't know, what's gonna, a friend of mine has this great line, and it's, we're all 3 days away from being tabloid news. And most of us are on day 2. And I think we need to preach there, because I do think, probably even more than when I heard this, like before, 2014 or whatever. I feel like a lot of us are there. And for you as a preacher to realize that you are not exempt from that either, I think that's helped my preaching anyway. So.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for this conversation. This has been really good and very helpful. If people want to learn more about you, follow you on social media, where should they go?
So I'm on Instagram. I'm Rev Benz because there was a time when I really wanted a Mercedes Benz. I've given up on that. And then I also have a Substack, where I write the kind of devotionals before the Sunday, and that's it's under Notes from DeHart. But dude, thank you so much for having me on this. Thank you for what you're doing. Really appreciate it.
And thank you. All right. So I want to thank Ben for taking the time to chat with me for this episode. And I'm curious about your thoughts. Are there ideas that you have when it comes to revitalizing a congregation? What stories do you have about your congregation? I'd love to hear that. So feel free to send me an email at churchandmain@substack.com. I will include a link to the Living Church article from 2024. Feel free to give it a read. If you want to learn more about this podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, visit churchandmain.org. And you can also go to churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. You can subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app, and I hope that you would please consider leaving a rating or review that helps others find this podcast. So that's it for this episode of Church in Maine. As I always like to say, thank you so much for listening. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.